The Misadventures of Lieutenant Commander Edwards and Midshipman Elliot. Episode 1, Blue Cheese. Written and read by Benjamin Vassell. Author's note. For a written version, as well as a 18+ version of this story, please visit gaysci-fi-stories.substack.com. Link in the description field. If you enjoy this story, consider sharing it with just 2 other people that you think might also enjoy it. That is the biggest thing you can do to help this channel grow and to help me with my creative writing journey. I sat up. My heart was pounding in my chest. I looked about the dingy greyness of my cabin. Canterbury, lights, I called into the air, and they faded on slowly, bringing colour back to the room. The dream had already dissipated, like smoke on the wind, the only remnants a lingering sense of panic. Canterbury, what time is it? 0223, the soft voice replied. Still 2.5 hours until my usual alarm. I sighed. I didn't think I'd get back to sleep now, not with the recent dose of unwarranted adrenaline now wreaking havoc with my endocrine system. I flipped my duvet from myself and headed to the bathroom. I relieved myself and splashed some water on my face. My honey-coloured eyes looked tired in the mirror, a little purple in the under eye, and my hair was sleep mussed. The auburn strands of my fringe were a little long. I'd get reprimanded if I didn't have them cut soon. I forwent a shower and instead changed into some United Earth Navy standard issue sportswear, a singlet and a pair of grey shorts. I pulled on a well-worn pair of trainers to complete the outfit and headed out of my cabin. The corridor was strange during the night shift. All the lights were faded to 50%, and there was hardly a crew member about. I headed towards the lifts in the centre of the corridor. The lift doors opened when I was still a few paces away, the onboard AI predicting my want to use the lift with a 96% accuracy rate. I stepped in, pressed the button for deck 6, and the door swished shut. A few seconds passed, and the door swished open again with a soft sigh. The corridor here was identical to the one I'd just left. Brushed aluminium walls, lights at 50%, and deserted. I was just about to turn right towards the gym when the sound of a second pair of doors opening caught my attention. "Elliot!" I exclaimed in surprise as the midshipman stepped out of the lift to the left of the one I had just exited. His driftwood hair had been combed into a meticulous side parting despite its short length. He was wearing UEN standard sportswear too, but he had gone for tracksuit bottoms and a grey t-shirt that seemed a size too small. "Lieutenant Commander!" His ash eyes held the same surprise that I felt, his arching pale eyebrows raised. Then he seemed to remember himself as he clasped his hands behind his back, fixed his mouth into a straight line and stood at attention. I couldn't help the way my lips turned up at one corner at his belated conformance to protocol. "As you were, midshipman." He relaxed back into a less precise position. "What are you doing out and about at this time anyway? You're not on the night shift as far as I can recall," I mused out loud. He shook his head, almost a gesture to himself than me. "No, I'm not. I woke up feeling somewhat restless and couldn't get back to sleep," he replied. "I thought I'd go to the lab and get some of my work done, but the night shifters just told me to bugger off." His eyes widened suddenly, and then he began to apologise. "Excuse my language, sir. I don't know what came over me." "No need to apologise, Elliot. There is nothing in the UEN Code of Conduct that prohibits a midshipman from saying bugger in front of a senior officer. Now, if you'd said fuck, that would have been quite a different matter." I grinned at him. He let out a nervous chuckle at my attempt at a joke. "So I assume after being told to bugger off you decided to go to the gym?" I surmised. "That's right, sir. When I can't work, it's the only way I can burn off excess energy." Judging by the tight, barely veiled muscles of the midshipman's arms and chest, I could only assume he must have often had excess energy. "Perhaps we can work out together. It would be useful to have a spotter." I was unsure why I made the offer. It was not my proclivity to fraternise with junior crew members off duty. But I wasn't going to rescind the offer now it had come out of my mouth. "Of course, sir." I wondered if he agreed out of affability, obligation, or whether he genuinely wanted a workout partner. Either way, we headed down the corridor to the gym, me in front and him on my tail. When we were stood in the almost empty gym, looking at the various training machines and free weights, I asked him, "Any preference of muscle group?" "No, whatever you prefer, sir." The response tasted distinctly of obligation. I don't think I'm in the mood for legs this morning. Let's start on the bench press. We moved over to the piece of equipment and started loading plates. I slotted 20 kilos onto the bar, and the midshipman mimicked it on the other end. I put another 10, and the midshipman mimicked that too. I took the first set, laying on my back on the bench as Elliot spotted me from behind. After 10 reps, I hoisted the weights and sat up. "Are you alright for 60 kilos? I asked. "Yes, sir." I felt my lips twitching again. I could tell Elliot was being careful not to break protocol again, but I saw no fun in that. "Sir" is fine for when we're on duty, but I'd prefer Mason when we are not. Surprise washed over the midshipman's features, and then they came back to neutrality. "Yes, Mason." "And you're Archibald, right?" "Yes," he replied somewhat hesitantly. I grinned at him, hoping it was friendly. We took it in turns to bench the weight until we'd had enough, and we decided to move to the shoulder press next. "You're posted in the botany lab, right?" I began as Elliot was just finishing his last few reps. "Yes," he replied efficiently, standing up. I took his place but only slung my arms over the handles of the machine. "Tell me, Arch, what are you guys working on down there these days?" He looked at me with slightly raised eyebrows, perhaps at the unsolicited nickname, but answered nonetheless. "The lab has many functions." It sounded as if he were going to give me the answer I would find in an end-of-day report, so I interjected, "Have you been working on anything interesting lately?" He hesitated for a moment before replying, "I've been working with some interesting flora we picked up during our mission to Bloo last month." "Oh?" I remembered our field mission to Bloo last month being rather uneventful. Just a few of the scientist types collecting some rather mundane samples. I certainly hadn't heard about any interesting updates, but then again, I never had been very interested in plants. "Yes, there is this one in particular I've been working with which contains a remarkable enzyme in its leaf stem. It's still early days, but initial testing suggests that it might be able to double the speed of dermal healing. Now, I know with dermal healing technology that seems rather redundant, but as a salve in the field it might prove invaluable." It was the most words I had gotten out of the midshipman, well, ever, and certainly the most enthusiastic. "You know, I've been posted to the Canterbury for almost 6 months, and I've never been down to the botany lab." It was more of a thought that just happened to come out of my mouth as conversation. "Well, you should come along sometime. I'd be happy to give you the official tour if you'd like." Now it was my turn to be surprised, but I beamed at the midshipman. This offer was definitely made out of affability. "I'd like that very much. I'll see if I can fit it into my duty schedule today," I said, before getting back to the shoulder press. It had been a long day. Minor systems had been playing up all over the ship. Worst of all, a cooling pipe had burst in the engine room, putting 3 crewmen into medical. Luckily, none would be there more than the night, and the corroded computer module that had been causing all the malfunctions had been replaced. And despite all that, and my brain and feet calling for bed, I was slightly peeved that I hadn't been able to get that tour from Midshipman Elliot. I decided to go to the lab anyway, so at least I could say that I'd actually been to it at least once. It was odd, as a senior member of the crew, that there would be parts of the ship that I had never been to. The doors opened with a gentle swoosh at my arrival, and, to my surprise, there he was, far after shift had ended, hunched over a lab bench and looking through the lens of a microscope. There was a plant on the bench too, not far from him. It had sprawling deep green leaves, each larger than the trays used to serve lunch in the canteen, and with thick stems that burst directly out of the soil. Each leaf had a symmetrical pattern of 6 or 8 large round holes, like they had been pressed out of it with a biscuit cutter. Elliot hadn't seemed to notice my entrance. The lab was rather more cramped than I thought it might be. I wasn't going to get much of a tour, at any rate. It was only about half again as big as my cabin, and I could see the entirety of it from one position. There were but 2 lab benches running down the narrow length of the room, with stools that came up to my waist dotted around. In glass-fronted cabinets were vials of diligently labelled liquids, stacks of beakers and measuring cylinders, and in 1 or 2 there were potted plants, some with electrical measuring devices clipped onto their leaves, and others with devices sticking out of the surrounding soil like incense sticks. I checked my appearance in one of the glass cupboards that ran along the closest wall. My image looked back at me, faint and obscured by the scientific equipment stored behind the glass. My eyes looked even darker and more sunken than they had that morning, and the product I'd run through my hair had given up the ghost. I tried to push the orange strands of my fringe back into some modicum of order. I put on my charmingest smile and went up to the midshipman. When I reached the bench, I leaned right into Elliot's ear and whispered, "You know shift ended 2 hours ago." He startled like a rabbit at the sound of a gunshot, and then settled like a displeased kitten. The reaction had the corners of my lips twitching up in a roguish way. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, in an even tone, looking to me. The short white blonde hairs of his fringe that had been so exacting that morning were now sticking up at different angles, presumably where he had brushed his hand through them while working. "Oh, we're not on duty, Arch. Mason will do." "Of course." "Working overtime?" I asked. "No, I must have got carried away." He tapped the slate laying on his desk with one long finger, and its screen activated, showing the time. "It happens." "I'm sure," I smirked at him. "What are you looking at?" I nodded towards the microscope. "Oh!" He looked back at the equipment like he had almost forgotten it was there. "Skin cells. I've added a solution containing some of the enzymes from the leaf stem." He pointed to the plant on the bench. "I'm monitoring how fast the cells are dividing." I nodded politely at his explanation and then looked back to the rather innocuous-looking plant sitting on the bench. Up closer, I realised there was a rectangular name label stuck in the soil at the base of the plant. "Blue cheese," I read out loud and furrowed my eyebrows. "Yes, I came up with the name. Rather amusing, don't you think?" I looked at Elliot. He was smiling a small smile to himself, laughing at a joke I didn't understand, his eyes crinkled at the corners. "I'm sorry, but the joke quite escapes me," I confessed. "Oh, well, you see, this plant looks rather like the invariably popular monstera back on Earth." I looked at him blankly. "More commonly known as the cheese plant, because of the holes. Like Gruyere," he explained, the small smile never leaving his lips. "Ah, and you picked up this plant from Bloo, so blue cheese. That's a terrible pun, Arch," I chortled despite myself. "Oh, us botanists pride ourselves on terrible puns. Some garner great prestige in their species naming ability." I grinned at him and thought his grin in return charming despite myself. And then I remembered, "Oh, I'm sorry I wasn't able to fit your tour into my schedule today. What with that burst coolant pipe and everything, I was swamped." "Burst coolant pipe?" he asked, his almost pencil-drawn eyebrows drawing together. "You didn't hear about it? We've all been rushing around like mad people all afternoon." "Ah, sorry, not much gets through to me when I'm deep into my research. Much to the bane of some of my colleagues, I'm sure they would attest." I looked at him, my features equal measures amusement and askance, I'm sure, and followed up with, "It spilled coolant over 3 crew members. You can't imagine what the haranguing I got from Dr. Walker was like." Elliot chortled at that, a genuine laugh, the first one I had ever coaxed out of him. I felt like I had just won some kind of prize. Brad was like that even back when we were cadets. Neither rank, nor race, nor age, nor gender would stop that man from giving you a good telling off when you did something foolish. And then he added, with a slightly more worried look, "I hope everyone's okay, though." All patched back together and being monitored in the infirmary. "He may be a cantankerous bastard, but he sure is a good doctor." Elliot nodded in agreement. "So, you're friendly with the doctor?" Elliot shrugged. "We grab lunch together on occasion." The conversation seemed like it was coming to a natural end. I was about to excuse myself, my feet really protesting now, when the midshipman suddenly said, "I can give you that tour now if you like. I mean, if you have time." I looked about myself languidly. "I think I can see it all from here, to be honest." When my eyes settled back on him, he was looking at me with a smile like he knew a secret that I didn't. "This is just the clinical research section. Good for a controlled environment, but hardly very exciting." Elliot stood from the stool and tucked it under the bench neatly. "Follow me, and I'll show you why the botany lab is by far the best place on board." He spoke a little dramatically, and with a confidence I had yet to hear from him. "Lead the way," I encouraged. I followed him down to the back of the lab where there was a door set into the wall. I hadn't noticed it before because it was so well camouflaged, painted white and flush with the wall, but up close you could just about make out the seam between it and the wall, and a fingerprint scan to the right gave it away as a door. Elliot pressed a thumb to the pad and the door receded several millimeters before disappearing into the wall with a satisfactory hiss. The room we stepped into stretched out in front of us for at least half the length of the ship. I snapped my mouth shut from where it was hanging open in surprise. Along the length of the room were rows and rows of what looked like large steel boxes that had been riveted together along the corners and painted white as the walls and floor had been. And most unexpectedly, growing on top of each steel box was a patch of pumpkins, sticks of corn, tomato plants, green beans. And that was only what I could see in my immediate area. "What is all this?" I asked. Elliot chuckled to himself. "It's amazing how many people on board are oblivious to where their food comes from. All they care about is that it comes. This is the agricultural biome." "You mean to say everything we eat on board comes from here?" "Well, about 70%. All UEN Explorer-class ships are required to produce enough food to sustain its crew in case of an emergency situation. It's all part of the Ishikawa Protocol that was set up in 2294. "Yes, I think I remember reading something about that. Come on, let me show you how it works." He beckoned me over to one of the steel boxes, the one with yellow tomatoes growing out of it. Up close I could see that each plant was growing out of a 2-centimetre hole cut into a sheet of metal about as wide as my forearm. The sheet was curved down at the long edges, presumably for strength and rigidity, and at each short edge were attached 2 sets of wheels that ran along rails formed out of the lips of the painted steel box. The midshipman was easily able to separate 2 of the sheets, the wheels running almost silently along the rails, and part the rows of plants. Between the sheets came the sound of water slapping and splashing against itself. "Fish!" I exclaimed, seeing the creatures darting to and fro among the tangle of roots formed by the tomatoes. "They're fish tanks," I added. "Indeed," the midshipman affirmed. "We grow all the annuals on board using a hydroponic system. The fish fertilise the water, which feeds the plants, and the plants filter the water for the fish, and we eat the plants and the fish. It's a very efficient system." I was nodding like a cadet in a lecture back at Naval College. "I see why you might think this is the best place on board." He smiled that same small smile like he knew a secret I didn't. "This isn't the biome that makes the botany lab the best place on board." "There's more?" I exclaimed. I was exclaiming a lot that evening. "There is." He beckoned for me to follow him with a hand gesture, and we walked down half the length of the room, passing peppers and potatoes and leeks, and at the very centre of the room there was a break in the row of tanks and a pathway cut between them to the left and to the right. Elliot turned to the left and I followed after him. Another door, almost invisible apart from a hairline seam and a thumb pad. I had no idea what to expect before the door opened, but even if I had managed to guess, it was still almost unbelievable. The floor was unexpectedly soft as my boot pressed into it ever so slightly. When my eyes did adjust to the low light, I realised that it was grass that I had stepped onto. Soft green grass, the likes of which I hadn't seen since we left UEN Space Dock 6 months ago. And not far from me I can make out the gnarled trunk of a tree, reaching up and then splitting into branches. There were more trees too. In fact, they seemed to stretch on as far as I could see, although, admittedly, with the dark, that wasn't that far. Elliot took a few steps forward and turned back to me. Not many people are allowed in this section of the ship, only specialists and senior crew members, but it's my favourite place to come. It's so peaceful. He reached up and plucked something from the tree. I realised it was a peach when he chucked it to me. I caught it almost involuntarily after years of reflex training. "Incredible," is all I could say, not sure if I was speaking to the midshipman or the fruit itself. He walked a little further into the trees, and I followed him, biting into the peach, perfectly ripe and juicy. "We keep this biome temperate for the trees. It's programmed to mimic early autumn at the moment, so all the fruit are beginning to ripen." I nodded along, hardly paying attention to the meanings behind the words, but happy to hear the soft rambling of his voice as we walked through the enchanting, sprawling nature. I suddenly had the absurd image of being lured deep into the magical forest by a beautiful wood nymph. I shook the absurdity of the thought from my tired mind. We reached a small break in the trees, a little meadow area. The midshipman looked up and I followed his gaze. A bright, fat earth moon hung in the sky, thousands of tiny stars twinkling around it. "It's a hologram," the midshipman confessed, but it's pretty convincing. Amazing, I breathed out, and then turned to beam at him. The moonlight had transformed his hair to a brilliant white and was reflecting off the curve of his nose and lips. He could have been an expressionist portrait until he turned his head to look back at me. My grin widened further still. "What?" he asked, a grin slipping across his features too. And then my heart did this unexpected sort of nervous flutter in my chest, and I had to look away. "Nothing," I said, looking back to the moon. "Thank you for showing me this arch. It's beautiful." I started seeing the midshipmen everywhere after that. Of course, we were on a starship with a crew of less than 200, so I was probably bumping into him no more than I had been before, but now I was noticing him eating breakfast in the canteen, noticing him running laps in the gym, noticing him laughing with Walker as they worked on their salve. And although I suppose there was nothing against senior officers noticing junior members of the crew in UEN guidelines, I thought it best to leave it just as noticing. But then I found myself walking among the peach trees. It was brighter than the last time I had been there, and the trees seemed to stretch out in front and behind me forever. It must have been part of the holographic component of the biome. I was looking for someone. I found the little opening in the trees where wildflowers and meadow grasses swayed in the artificial breeze. There he was, Archibald, the person I was looking for. He smiled at me. "I was waiting for you," he said. "I'm here now," I reassured, going over to him. One of his hands reached out and took mine, his fingers gentle. He brought my hand to his lips and kissed the back of it. "I'm glad you found me," he said. "Me too," I admitted. And then I kissed him. Our lips pressed together hard and fast, our tongues lapping and licking together like we had both been dying of thirst and the other was an oasis in the desert. When we pulled apart, I was panting and he was smiling, lips and cheeks pink with blood. "I want you," I whispered. "I know," he said, his grey eyes scintillating in the artificial light. My eyes shot open. My duvet was clinging to my sweat-clammy skin. I had been dreaming. "Bollocks," I said out loud to no one. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more gay sci-fi stories, and if you have any ideas for gay sci-fi stories, please leave them in the comments below. See you next time. Bye.